They call it the SHU, a place so silent, inmates say they can hear their own sanity slipping away. Behind the concrete walls of Pelican Bay, California's most infamous Supermax, lies a world built not to punish the body, but to break the mind. Before we dive into this chilling reality, make sure to subscribe and turn on the bell icon, so you never miss another deep dive into the hidden corners of America's prison system. The northern edge of California feels almost forgotten, a cold stretch of coastline wrapped in fog and silence. It's here, near the Oregon border, that Pelican Bay State Prison rises from the redwood shadows like a fortress from another world. Built in 1989, Pelican Bay was designed to be the ultimate control environment, the state's answer to the rising wave of gang violence tearing through California's prison system in the 1980s. Inside, two realities exist side by side. One is the general population yard, where inmates serve time under watchful eyes but with a fragment of human contact. The other, known simply as the Security Housing Unit or SHU, is an entirely different existence. Here human beings live inside windowless concrete boxes, measuring 8 by 10 feet for 22 to 24 hours a day. There are no bars, no views, no sounds, only steel doors and white walls. According to the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation (CDCR), the SHU was meant to isolate the most dangerous and disruptive inmates, gang leaders, killers, and repeat offenders. But over the years, the list of who ended up in solitary grew longer. Men accused of gang association, sometimes based only on tattoos, books, or even drawings, found themselves locked away indefinitely. Former inmates describe it as buried alive. One prisoner, Todd Ashker, who later became the lead plaintiff in a landmark class action lawsuit, said, "It's not that they're trying to stop violence, they're trying to make you disappear." The cells are arranged in X-shaped pods, each monitored by remote cameras and intercoms. Meals slide through a slot in the door. There are no phone calls, no visits that allow touch, only video screens. Exercise happens alone in a concrete pen the size of a parking space, open to the sky but surrounded by 20-foot walls. Psychologists who studied Pelican Bay's SHU in the 1990s described the conditions as a controlled experiment in sensory deprivation. Dr. Stuart Gracian, a Harvard psychiatrist, interviewed dozens of inmates and documented symptoms now known as SHU Syndrome: hallucinations, paranoia, panic attacks, and severe depression. The brain, he wrote, is not built for isolation. Deprive it of input long enough, and it begins to create its own. For years, the CDCR denied that solitary confinement caused long-term harm. But evidence kept building. Internal documents, later obtained by journalists and lawyers, revealed hundreds of suicide attempts and self-mutilation incidents within Pelican Bay's SHU. Many of those men were not violent offenders, just individuals caught in a bureaucratic system that had no clear exit. By 2012, Pelican Bay had become a symbol of what critics called America's psychological Guantanamo. Prison officials argued it was necessary to keep order. But for those living inside, order came at the cost of humanity. Some inmates hadn't touched another person in over a decade. And as the outside world debated rehabilitation versus security, the men inside Pelican Bay's SHU quietly fought a war, not against guards but against their own minds. The human brain was never designed for silence this deep. Inside Pelican Bay's SHU, even the sound of your own breathing becomes unbearable after a while. The fluorescent lights stay on 24 hours a day, casting the same sterile glow whether it's 3 a.m. or 3 p.m. There's no clock, no sunrise, no rhythm. Time becomes a blur. For many, the first few weeks in solitary are about survival through structure. Inmates count the tiles on the floor, trace cracks in the ceiling, or do hundreds of push-ups to keep their sanity tethered to something real. But as the weeks turn into months and the months into years, something inside begins to shift. You start hearing things that aren't there, one former SHU inmate told the Sacramento Bee. You talk to the walls and after a while they start talking back. Psychiatrists call it hallucinatory compensation, the brain inventing sensory input to fill the void. For prisoners at Pelican Bay, it's not a theory. It's their daily existence. A 2011 study published by the Journal of the American Academy of Psychiatry and the Law found that over 80% of inmates in long-term solitary experience hallucinations, severe anxiety, or paranoia. In Pelican Bay's SHU, men reported seeing flashes of color, hearing phantom footsteps, or feeling insects crawl over their skin. Others described a constant echo in their heads, like the room itself was whispering to them. One man, identified only as inmate R, told researchers, "Sometimes I'd see faces forming in the concrete. They'd blink at me. When you've been locked down that long, you stop knowing what's real. The SHU's architecture reinforces this psychological descent. The walls are painted off-white, designed to reflect maximum light but no warmth. The air is cold, recycled, and carries a faint metallic taste. Every sound, a door clanging, a cough, a distant shout, reverberates like thunder. Inmates call it the hum. It's the sound of the ventilation system, constant and droning, so steady that many can't sleep without it once released. In 2013, the Center for Constitutional Rights published testimonies from Pelican Bay inmates held in isolation for more than a decade. Their words revealed a shared madness, an institutionalized loneliness that reshaped who they were. One inmate wrote, "I tried to remember my daughter's voice, but after so many years, even that faded. When I finally heard another human laugh again, I broke down crying." The California prison system defended the SHU by labeling its occupants as validated gang members. But the validation process, investigators found, was deeply flawed. Evidence could include a tattoo, a drawing, a book on political history, or even a Christmas card from another inmate. Once validated, release required debriefing, confessing gang involvement and naming others. Refusal meant indefinite isolation. That policy created what experts called a psychological trap. Inmates who were not active gang members refused to implicate innocent people, and those who were feared retribution. Either way, they stayed in the SHU, sometimes for decades. A landmark lawsuit, Ashker versus Governor of California, exposed these practices in 2012. The plaintiffs, many of whom had spent over 20 years in solitary, argued that indefinite isolation violated the Eighth Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment. The case sparked national attention. Media outlets like the New York Times, BBC, and 60 Minutes highlighted Pelican Bay's conditions, calling them a living laboratory of psychological torment. Even correctional officers began speaking out. One retired guard told the Los Angeles Times, "You could see it in their eyes. The ones who'd been there too long, they weren't dangerous anymore. They were broken." In 2013, more than 30,000 California prisoners launched a statewide hunger strike, the largest in U.S. history, protesting solitary confinement conditions. Pelican Bay was the heart of it. For 60 days, inmates refused food, demanding basic human contact and an end to indefinite isolation. The state eventually agreed to negotiate, but not before several inmates were hospitalized. The strike wasn't about luxury or comfort. It was about identity, about being seen as human again. "We're not asking for freedom," one striker wrote in an open letter. "We're asking for sunlight." For psychologists, Pelican Bay became a case study in what happens when a system forgets empathy. For inmates, it was proof that even in silence, voices could still rise. By 2013, Pelican Bay had become the epicenter of a quiet rebellion. For decades, the men buried inside its security housing unit, SHU, had been forgotten, dismissed as gang leaders, outlaws, and monsters. But in that year, something extraordinary happened. Men who had been isolated for more than 20 years began to organize a coordinated, statewide protest. Not through meetings, not through phone calls, but through letters smuggled out of concrete cells. It started with a handful of prisoners, Todd Ashker, Arturo Castellanos, George Franco, and Sidawa Nantambujama, 4 men held in solitary for decades. They were known to the Department of Corrections as validated gang members. But to each other they were brothers in endurance. Through tiny cracks in the system, censored mail, short interactions with lawyers, coded legal correspondence, they began building something that had never happened before in California's prison history, a multiracial, multi-prison alliance. The plan was simple but daring, a hunger strike that would unite inmates from every corner of the state, from San Quentin to Corcoran to Pelican Bay. Their message was clear. "We will not eat until we are treated as human beings." On July 8, 2013, the strike began. Within 48 hours, it spread to 24 California prisons involving more than 30,000 inmates. It became the largest prison hunger strike in U.S. history. The 5 core demands of the strikers were handwritten and circulated through the prison grapevine. End long-term solitary confinement. Abolish group punishments and administrative abuse. Stop the debriefing policy that forced inmates to snitch to earn release. Provide adequate food, education, and rehabilitation programs. Create fair procedures for SHU placement and release. For many watching from the outside, this was the first time the public realized that men inside Pelican Bay were being held in solitary for decades, without clear sentences, trials, or review. The average time in the SHU exceeded 7 years. Some, like Ashker, had been there over 2 decades. The strike quickly gained attention. Civil rights groups, journalists, and international organizations began investigating. Amnesty International released a report titled, "The Edge of Endurance," calling Pelican Bay's SHU a form of cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture, Juan E. Mendez, declared that solitary confinement beyond 15 days could amount to torture. In California, thousands had surpassed that limit by years, even decades. As days turned into weeks, prison officials faced a dilemma. The strike was spreading faster than any disciplinary system could contain. Hundreds of inmates were hospitalized for dehydration and malnutrition. Yet the strike continued. "We didn't have weapons," one participant later said. "Our bodies were the only protest we had left." The hunger strike shook the walls of Pelican Bay in a way no riot ever could. Inside the SHU, guards who once viewed inmates as irredeemable began to see them differently. One correctional officer told The Guardian, "I've been here 20 years. I've seen fights, stabbings, everything. But this was discipline on another level. They were starving themselves just to be heard." Public opinion began to shift. News crews camped outside the prison gates, and families of the inmates gathered with banners reading, "End Torture in California Prisons." Even some state legislators began questioning how such conditions had been allowed to exist for so long. The hunger strike eventually ended after 60 days, following tentative agreements from the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation (CDCR) to review SHU policies. But the movement didn't stop there. It had ignited something deeper, a conversation about human rights inside U.S. prisons. The aftermath of the strike led to Ashker versus Governor of California, a class-action lawsuit filed in 2012 and expanded in 2013. Represented by the Center for Constitutional Rights, the plaintiffs argued that prolonged solitary confinement violated constitutional protections against cruel and unusual punishment. When the case settled in 2015, it changed the system forever. The settlement effectively ended indefinite solitary confinement in California. Thousands of inmates were released from the SHU into general population units. The CDCR agreed to review every inmate's case and to create a new step-down program, a structured system allowing gradual reintegration. For the first time in decades, men who had not seen sunlight without a cage above them walked into open yards again. Some had not touched another human being since the 1980s. But freedom was not the same as recovery. The psychological scars of isolation ran deep. One former SHU inmate, released after 25 years in solitary, told NPR, "The first time someone brushed against my arm in the yard, I panicked. My brain didn't know what to do. That's what solitary does. It teaches you to fear people." Pelican Bay's rebellion was more than a protest. It was a revelation, proof that silence can be broken even in the world's most silent place. Yet as the gates opened and the men stepped into the light, another question lingered. Can the human mind ever truly heal from decades of isolation? When the heavy doors finally opened, it wasn't freedom that poured in, it was confusion. For men who had spent 10, 15, even 25 years inside Pelican Bay's windowless cells, the world outside felt alien. The air smelled different. The sounds, birds, laughter, traffic, hit like a storm. One former inmate described it as stepping into another planet. The 2015 Ashker versus Governor of California settlement marked a turning point. Over 1,000 inmates were transferred out of the SHU and back into general population units across California. But their minds had been trained by solitude, programmed for survival in silence. Rehabilitation wasn't as simple as unlocking a door. According to a Stanford Law report analyzing post-SHU adjustment, many of these men exhibited what psychologists call post-isolation syndrome. It's a condition that mirrors post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, but is rooted in sensory deprivation rather than violence. Symptoms include hypersensitivity to sound and movement, difficulty making eye contact, chronic anxiety, and distrust of others. A man known in court filings as Inmate M told researchers, "I didn't know how to walk around people anymore. If someone got too close, my body tensed up automatically." In the SHU, closeness meant danger. Inside the general population yards, these newly released men found themselves surrounded by voices again, hundreds of them. The clang of steel gates, the echo of shouting, even the distant sound of a radio, all normal in prison life, became unbearable. Many requested to go back to isolation not because they missed it but because it was all they knew. Dr. Craig Haney, a psychologist from the University of California, Santa Cruz, had interviewed dozens of Pelican Bay inmates since the 1990s. His follow-up studies after the settlement painted a grim picture. For many, solitary confinement rewires the brain. You can't just take someone from 20 years of silence and expect them to act normally overnight. One of his patients described the first night after release from the SHU. "I couldn't sleep because it was too quiet. Then I realized, it wasn't quiet at all. I could hear breathing, footsteps, the guard's radio. My brain didn't know what to focus on anymore." Inmates who once dreamed of simple freedoms, sunlight, conversation, human touch, now found those same things overwhelming. Even the act of choosing what to eat in the cafeteria triggered anxiety. "In the SHU they slide food through a slot," said another man identified as RJ. "Out here I had to walk in line, pick up a tray, sit down next to strangers. It sounds small but it felt like war." The CDCR introduced the Step Down Program, SDP, to help reintegrate long-term SHU inmates. The program included gradual increases in social interaction, group therapy, and limited access to jobs and education. But implementation was uneven. Some prisons lacked qualified mental health staff. Others viewed the program as a bureaucratic checkbox rather than a true rehabilitation process. By 2017, watchdog organizations like Solitary Watch and the Prison Law Office reported that hundreds of inmates had technically left the SHU, but were still living in near isolation, in modified housing units under different names. Advocates called it the SHU by another name. The California Inspector General's 2018 report confirmed these concerns. While indefinite solitary confinement has formally ended, the psychological effects of prolonged isolation continue to manifest among the affected population. Many require long-term psychiatric care. Some of the men, once released back into society after completing their sentences, struggled even more. The outside world, filled with noise, light, and constant human contact, became a new kind of prison. Simple things like crossing a street or standing in a grocery line triggered panic. A man named Stephen Zifra, who spent 8 years in Pelican Bay's SHU, described his first days of freedom in an interview with The New Yorker. "I walked into a supermarket and froze. The colors, the lights, the choices, I couldn't process any of it. I just left my cart and ran outside." Some turned to art, writing, and advocacy to rebuild meaning. Former SHU inmates began speaking publicly about the psychological damage of solitary confinement, forming groups like California Families Against Solitary Confinement, CFASC. They toured universities, testified before lawmakers, and told their stories not as victims, but as witnesses to a system few truly understood. Their message was consistent. "We're not asking for sympathy. We're asking you to understand what happens when you lock a human being in silence for decades." Science began catching up to their experiences. Neuroscientists using MRI scans found that prolonged sensory deprivation could shrink regions of the brain responsible for memory, emotion, and decision-making. Other studies linked solitary confinement to higher rates of suicide, not only during incarceration but also after release. The truth became undeniable. Solitary confinement didn't just punish. It altered people, biologically, psychologically, and spiritually. Still, Pelican Bay remains operational. Though fewer men now occupy its SHU, its legacy continues to haunt California's prison system. To this day, some of those once locked inside are still fighting for recognition, therapy, and justice. Freedom, for them, is not measured in steps outside the cell. It's measured in silence, and how they choose to live with it. In the sterile silence of Pelican Bay's SHU, the human brain becomes its own enemy. Deprived of sound, touch, sunlight, and social contact, it begins to unravel in ways science is only beginning to understand. For decades, prison officials claimed solitary confinement was a matter of control, a disciplinary necessity. But neuroscientists and psychologists who've studied Pelican Bay's inmates discovered something far more disturbing. Prolonged isolation changes the structure of the brain itself. A study led by Dr. Huda Akil at the University of Michigan found that sensory deprivation reduces activity in the hippocampus, the brain's memory center. The longer a person stays in isolation, the more those neural pathways deteriorate. "We are social animals," Dr. Akil explained. "When you remove human contact, the brain circuits for empathy, reasoning, and emotion begin to shut down." At UC Berkeley, researchers analyzed the brains of long-term solitary prisoners and found significant shrinkage in the prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for decision-making and emotional regulation. This mirrored results from experiments on animals kept in isolation. Mice deprived of stimulation began exhibiting behaviors identical to depression, paranoia, and self-harm. Dr. Stuart Gracian, the Harvard psychiatrist who first documented SHU Syndrome, described it as a form of induced psychosis. It's not that they're going crazy, he said. It's that the environment is designed to make sanity impossible. Many Pelican Bay inmates reported similar experiences: hallucinations, time distortion, and what psychologists call identity diffusion, where the sense of self dissolves under prolonged confinement. One inmate said, "I stopped using my name. I stopped talking. After a few years, I wasn't a person, just a number waiting for the door to open." Even brief stints in solitary can cause measurable harm. A 2020 study by the Journal of Neuroscience confirmed that isolation for more than 10 days raises cortisol, the body's stress hormone, to levels comparable to those seen in victims of torture. The longer the confinement, the harder it becomes for the brain to recover. For those who survived Pelican Bay's SHU, the scars linger in ways no medical scan can fully capture. Nightmares, paranoia, memory gaps, and emotional detachment have become lifelong companions. Some can't sleep without light. Others can't stand silence. Freedom, ironically, becomes another kind of confinement. Even correctional officers who worked in Pelican Bay's SHU reported secondary trauma. One guard told The Guardian, "You don't realize how heavy silence is until you work here. It gets inside you. You carry it home." The ripple effects extended beyond prison walls. Families of inmates described talking to loved ones who seemed emotionally absent, their voices flat, their laughter gone. Children grew up visiting fathers they could only see through bulletproof glass. Wives wrote letters that went unanswered for years, unsure if their husbands were even alive. By the late 2010s, the evidence had reached critical mass. Courts, medical boards, and international watchdogs began echoing the same message: solitary confinement is psychological torture. In 2019, the American Psychological Association formally urged lawmakers to abolish long-term solitary, stating that its use inflicts profound and often irreversible harm. Today, Pelican Bay still stands, its SHU now less populated but not forgotten. The building remains a monument to an era when punishment eclipsed humanity. Some cells sit empty. Others house inmates for shorter, restricted terms. But the echoes remain: the hum of the ventilation, the clang of steel, the silence that once swallowed entire lives. For those who lived through it, the question is no longer whether solitary confinement is cruel. It's why it took so long for the world to listen. The story of Pelican Bay isn't just about a prison. It's about what happens when a society decides that silence is justice, when punishment replaces understanding. From the fog-covered coast of Crescent City to the empty corridors of the SHU, thousands of men endured a kind of invisibility no human being should face. Their testimonies forced America to confront a painful truth: we built places that destroy the mind in the name of safety. Some have found redemption, others never recovered. But every story told, every document uncovered, every court ruling won, chips away at that silence a little more. Because justice without humanity isn't justice at all. If this story moved you, don't let it fade into silence. Hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell, because here we bring the hidden truths of America's prisons to light. Comment below with your thoughts on solitary confinement. Do you believe it still has a place in modern justice? Thank you for watching Behind Bars TV. Until next time, stay aware, stay informed, and never stop questioning what happens behind closed doors.